Palestinians have been saying this from the very beginning, but nobody can believe Palestinians because they're Arabs and they're probably liars. So we can't trust them. But when an Israeli historian says this, now people are paying attention, especially an Israeli historian with German background. The other thing is, now this is not a story of heroism anymore. This is more a story of terrorism. It was basically a prolonged terrorist attack by an armed militia against the civilian population with the clear intent of the ethnic cleansing of the land. Now, like I said, a lot of people say that there was no Palestine. Or if there was a Palestine, then really there was nothing there. Or if there was something there, then these were just poor villages and, Bedouins, and, there was really nothing. Anything of consequence that was brought to Palestine was brought to Palestine by the Jewish immigration. So I like to show these pictures. This is from an example of one city, one Palestinian city from before 1948. It's the city of Jaffa. It was a city of about 120,000 people with a rich business life, a rich political life, trade unions, several newspapers, movie theaters, and so on. Clearly there was someone there. Beautiful boulevards. The Jamal Pasha Theater was a famous theater. The biggest names in the Middle East would come and perform there. And this thriving metropolis in Palestine, in the spring of 1948, in 2 weeks it was reduced to about 3,000 people, from 120,000 to about 3,000 people, all concentrated in one neighborhood with barbed wires and Israeli guards surrounding them. And on the ruins of, and a picture almost from the exact same angle, is the city of Tel Aviv. Now there is still a Yaffa. In fact, Tel Aviv calls itself Tel Aviv Yafo, as though there's an extension to the past, some glorious past. And there still is a Palestinian community in Jaffa, very small, neglected, oppressed, subject to constant harassment by the Israeli security forces. And beyond this little history lesson, there's something else that's important to understand. You cannot reduce Palestine to just the West Bank and Gaza. This is not the West Bank or Gaza. This is, of course, considered Israel. There are Palestinians in Jaffa, which is now called Tel Aviv. There are Palestinians in the Galilee. There are Palestinians in Jerusalem. There are Palestinians in the Negev Desert. There are Palestinians everywhere. You cannot reduce Palestine into these two little areas called the West Bank and Gaza. Because Palestinians, regardless of where they live, they are subject to the oppression of the State of Israel, albeit different laws, different groups, different bureaucracies that deal with them. And I think this is something we have to learn to accept. The entire country is Palestine. Palestinians live everywhere. In fact, they make up the majority of the population today. I'll touch on that in just a little bit. Now, another issue that, of course, is in the news quite a lot, comes and goes, but it's in the news quite a lot, is the issue of Gaza. And there's never any context. There's this place called Gaza, there's these people called Hamas, and then there's these rockets flying out because they want to kill Jews. This is, summing it up, is basically the story. So I'd like to touch on Gaza for just a little bit. I'm not going to go through the entire list of stats there, but these are interesting things. Now, the Gaza Strip is not a naturally delineated area. It was delineated by Israel. After the War of 1948, as a result of the ethnic cleansing, they needed a place to herd hundreds of thousands of refugees, Palestinian refugees. The Gaza Strip was created as a place around the city of Gaza to push these refugees into and to house them. And the attacks on Gaza did not begin in 2008 or last year. They began pretty much as soon as the Gaza Strip was established in the early 1950s. The ethnic cleansing of Palestine went on into the early 1950s. And Palestinians, particularly from the southern part of the country, were pushed into the Gaza Strip. So the reason there are refugees in the Gaza Strip is because of what happened in 1948. Now, like I said, Israeli forces began attacking Gaza almost as soon as the Gaza Strip was established, in the early 1950s. In the beginning, the reason that was given was because there were infiltrators. And what were these infiltrators? something very mean, something very deadly and scary, some kind of an ISIS or something, an early version of ISIS. They were called infiltrators. And these were mostly Palestinians who either tried to go back to their land, to bring food to their families, from time to time, of course, commit acts of violence against Israel. But basically, this was a poor community of refugees. So Israeli forces would go in, Israeli commandos would go in and commit horrific acts of violence against the population, an unarmed, basically poor population of refugees. Then later on, they changed the name. They weren't called infiltrators anymore. They were called fedayeen, also something very mysterious and threatening. Then later on, the name changed, and they were called just terrorists. So we're going through the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. Now they are called Hamas. The names change. The technology improves. So whereas in the beginning, maybe they only killed dozens, last summer they murdered over 2,000 people in 51 days. So the technology improves. But it's still the same thing. It's the state of Israel attacking an innocent civilian, unarmed population. And the question that begs to be asked is why? Why do they keep attacking Gaza? There has never been, certainly not a serious military threat from Gaza. There's never been an existential threat to Israel from Gaza. Why are they attacking? What is behind this? When we look at the pictures of the tanks, this is from 2009, countless tanks, thousands, tens of thousands of ground forces, thousands of flyovers that are bombing them from the air. I was there last summer, actually, during the attack. I was there, and I drove down to the border, just to drove around that border of Gaza. And at one point in the southern part, which is where the ground forces came in, you suddenly see this endless field of green. And when you come closer, you realize these are tanks. More tanks than you can even imagine. You would think World War III or maybe World War II is back. Rommel is back from World War II. What is going on? Why do they need so many tanks? And this is after thousands of attacks from the air. Millions of bombs that were dropped from the air. They called 40,000 reservists. Who is it in Gaza? Is it the Chinese? Is it the Germans are back? Who is it in Gaza that requires such heavy, heavy, heavy force? And of course, we look at the results. And again, the question that begs to be asked is why? And I believe that the answer is, while there is no threat, military threat certainly, there is none from Gaza that ever has been. When we look at the Gaza Strip, the threat is to the legitimacy of the state of Israel. Because when we see the refugees, we see the poverty, we see this inhumane reality minutes away from Israeli cities where people live like this. Minutes away. There's no clean water. There's no water fit for drinking in the Gaza Strip. Almost 2 million people live there, the vast majority of whom are under 18. 5 minutes away, a 5-minute, 10-minute drive, Israeli cities, you wouldn't dream of not having clean water or electricity or antibiotics if your child has an ear infection. Never mind the bombing. When we look at that, it raises doubts as to the legitimacy of the state of Israel. And that is why Gaza must be attacked. Because doing nothing is not an option. You've got almost 2 million people living in the Gaza Strip in insanely inhumane conditions that were imposed on them by Israel. So, you either have to allow them back home and fix this, allow these refugees to go back to their homes, fix the problem, allow aid to come in, rebuild, which Israel won't do, of course, or you have to kill them and then blame them for the violence. And that's the choice that Israel has opted for from the very beginning. So these attacks on Gaza are nothing new. These massacres committed by Israeli forces in Gaza are nothing new. It's been going on for almost 7 decades. And what Israel is fighting for, what Israel is killing for, is to maintain the narrative